and welcome to another episode of Evolving Prisons with me, Keegan Carey. Today, I'm discussing the case of Lucy Letby. 33-year-old Lucy was convicted last week of murdering 7 babies and attempting to murder 6 more at the Countess of Chester Hospital. Today, I am joined by Dr. Naomi Murphy. Dr. Murphy is one of the most respected clinical and forensic psychologists in the UK. She has 25 years' experience of working with violent offenders. Today, we are discussing what might have motivated somebody like Lucy to do the things she did, why she might have done some of the things she did, such as taking photos of the babies that she tried to kill and asking to bathe them after they died. We also discuss what prison might be like for somebody like Lucy, and we also discuss whether somebody like Lucy can ever be rehabilitated. Thank you for tuning into this episode. So, Dr. Murphy, thanks so much for joining me today. I wanted to reach out to you because you are one of the UK's most respected forensic psychologists, and I know that you have worked with violent offenders in the UK. And I wanted to talk to you about the Lucy Letby case, and I'm sure a lot of the listeners will know about it. So thank you so much for taking the time to come on and share your experience with us.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's always nice to be given an opportunity to talk about clinical work. So yeah, thank you.
So Lucy has been convicted, as we know, of murdering 7 children and attempting to murder 6 others. So on the one hand, we have got this cold and callous killer, but a lot of people have also described her as being gentle, timid and kind. Some of her friends have even said that although she's been convicted, they still don't believe she did it. And one of the consultants on the ward said that she was no different than any other nurse that he'd worked with. So how do we have that? How do we have a person who can have such different personas?
I think there's a lot for people to get their heads around in terms of that, isn't it? I think we all have an idea of the kind of person who uses violence. I think the stereotype is somebody who loses their temper at very short notice. They fly off the handle, fly into a rage, perhaps have a bit of an edge about them. I mean, in some ways, the Begbie character out of Trainspotting is, I think, how many people conjure up the idea of what happens when somebody kills, that sense of there's a brooding, menacing violence there. And I think most of us, whilst we would never use aggression and violence ourselves, we do have an ability to understand how easy it is to feel really angry and get very overwhelmed and carry out those acts. But in my experience, I'm not even sure that's the majority of people that I've met in prison who've committed acts of murder. I think the people that are probably most chilling to me are the people who just seem really ordinary. If you met them in a pub, you wouldn't think for a moment that they were psychologically disturbed enough to commit that kind of act. And so actually that it is always harder with those kind of individuals because I suppose for all of us to feel safe, we like to feel that we'd be able to spot somebody who would pose a risk to us. But, the reality is people end up in relationships with people who kill them. And obviously they weren't cued into the idea that this person was going to pose a threat to them at that moment in time. So, actually most people who kill probably can present as perfectly psychologically balanced for an awful lot of the time. I think, one of the things that's really striking about people who kill is, in my experience, they've always had the most horrendous childhoods, even if at first they don't look like that. And actually, if you've had a very brutal childhood, you have to find a way to cope with that. And people end up emotionally disconnecting from their emotional self. So they can end up quite split, quite dissociated, and quite fragmented. Now, sometimes that that can go so far that part of the healthy part of the individual won't even be aware of the other part's actions. But actually, even dissociation on a smaller level whereby somebody can get into a state where they would do something that seems quite out of character, it's not that unusual when we're talking about serious crimes.
Okay, that's really helpful, and it kind of then gives me a bit more insight into some of the things I've read where the consultant, for example, spoke to Lucy after more of the murders had happened, and said to her, "How are you feeling? Are you off this weekend?" And he said that he was quite concerned because she was just very casual and was like, "No, I'm working tomorrow." And her friends had said it was very out of character. So I suppose that then feeds into and explains that for us. So thank you so much. But one of the criminologists was asked about whether she has the characteristics of a typical serial killer. And one of the BBC reporters said, "I don't know what a prolific child killer looks like, but I don't think it's this." But if you're saying that they tend to be quite normal looking, in your experience, does a serial killer tend to have a specific look or characteristics that Lucy might not have demonstrated?
I don't think we can say there's a typical serial killer in all honesty, because serial killing is extremely rare. So probably since Jack, I read somewhere that since Jack the Ripper, there's been 34 cases of serial killing. I'm not sure when that data was from, but let's say no more than 40 in this huge time frame. Now, of course, it could be that people are killing and getting away with it, because serial killing is more likely to be calculated and planned, and there'd be some concealment. We actually have a very good conviction rate when people are commit acts of murder in the more impulsive, spontaneous way that I described earlier. But I think we assume that most perpetrators of violence are men, but actually women are capable of doing all of the same things that men are capable of doing. And actually we have, a very similar case of Beverly Allett, within living memory, who killed children. And, the reality is people who kill look the same as you and I. Some of those people are so out of control in terms of their emotional state that they're acting out on a regular basis. So we quickly get a sense that something's not quite right with them, and we wouldn't want to upset them or get into an argument with them. But that isn't the majority of people. The majority of people are able to go about their business, and then something will happen which then overwhelms and triggers them into a state of rage. I think when it comes to people who commit these kind of offences, where there's a pattern of repeated serial killing, it would be defined really by someone who's committed at least 3 acts of murder on 3 separate occasions. Now, my experience is when people have committed an act of murder in a kind of like a more rageful way, there is often this real period of chaos immediately afterwards, where actually they're full of panic, probably struggling with feelings of remorse and guilt around that time. And people can even develop post-traumatic stress disorder as a consequence of the act of killing. But what's really striking about, in this case, is Lucy Letby's murders were very close to one another. So there's not much evidence there isn't evidence of a protracted period of being in chaos or regretting what she's done. People who use violence on a more regular basis might lash out in some way and then think, oh, shit, I need to get better control of myself, make sure that doesn't happen again. There's this kind of like short-lived determination maybe, but there's not much evidence of that there. In this case, 7 murders and 6 attempted murders within a 12-month period, and sometimes within, literally just a matter of a couple of days, would suggest that there's something more calculated about Lucy Letby's crimes. And, the vast majority of murders don't happen in that way. The vast majority are not planned, or certainly not planned to that degree, and there's very little attempt. There's not the foresight to try and cover up. As I said, that's why most murderers are caught.
Yeah, and we saw that she kept diaries, and people were talking about what she wrote in them. I'm evil, I did this. Could that potentially have been her period of feeling guilty?
I think it could be, and I think especially if you've got somebody who's quite dissociative, so perhaps a part to the. Over time, psychologists have got much more. I think people were quite frightened to think about dissociation previously, but people have got much more comfortable thinking about dissociation, because all of us, if we're in circumstances where we feel a little bit, something makes us feel a little bit more anxious or insecure, we might behave in ways that we might not be proud of at another point in time. And I'm not talking about crime, but we might kind of like find ourselves going to pieces a little bit because we've been triggered by something that's happened. And I think, people who have, or who are more clinically dissociative, that is really quite a split. And so it's perfectly possible that murder can be carried out. The person would have this period of feeling really dreadful, think I'm evil, I really wish I hadn't done this. But then with anyone who commits an act of murder, there is an inability to tolerate your emotions and to try and get rid of them as quickly as possible. And so, I would say the fact that these murders are so close together would suggest that in Lucy Letby's case, she was able to get rid of her emotions quite easily, actually.
Okay. And the police and the Crown Prosecution Service have never been able to establish a motive. And I know that you were actually on GB News, and the police officer, I'm not sure what ranking he was, but he had said that it's not our job to establish the why, it's the what, the where. In your experience, can you think of what her motive could have been?
I would only be speculating, because that's impossible to know that without having met her and asked questions. But when thinking about this over the last few days, looking at cases of the reasons why healthcare professionals have killed, and obviously we're all aware of Dr. Shipman, who killed it appears to be as kind of like an act of mercy because of having wanting to put somebody out of misery and pain at the end of life. There was Colin Norris, who killed elderly people because he hated old people. Now, it's possible that Lucy Letby hates babies, and that could be a motive. There's also the possibility of enjoying the excitement of having power over life and death, as we saw in the case of Ben Green. But I think the two motives that stand out for me as being most likely are, there's this idea of, we think of nurses anyway to some degree as being kind of like angels. If you look at how nurses were idealised during the pandemic, everyone on their doorsteps clapping for nurses, and we like the idea of nurses being kind of like angels, if you like. And some of the accounts of Lucy Letby suggest that she revelled in that role of being very supportive and being very caring. So that's one possibility, and the second one, I think, is possibility that she was envious of the family unit, or there was something around the relationship with parents where maybe she wanted to attack them or destroy the family unit. And I suppose my reason for hypothesising around that is that she does seem to have been very preoccupied with the family. So she was searching for them on Facebook on Christmas Day. Well, that is not normal behaviour for a nurse in any setting. Sending a card in their grief, I think that's relatable too. But the fact that she took a photograph of the card, I think, is a little bit unusual. And so for me, this involvement with the families suggests that there's something about the family unit that's perhaps playing a role in there. But we won't know until people have more of an understanding of her background and are able to have those kind of discussions with it. My experience of working with people who've killed is that there is always a reason, and there is always a motive, and their story always makes sense. But we don't necessarily have all those pieces of the jigsaw. And, quite often we don't ask the right kind of questions. So I worked with one man who'd killed his dad, and there'd been numerous reports saying, oh, well, this guy had a normal childhood, his dad was a bit strict. But part of the problem was the questions hadn't been asked in a way that enabled the man to really tell his story. So there was no exploration of what a bit strict meant. So the individual who described this relationship with his dad as being a bit strict, when I actually asked him, well, how were you punished? Actually, what came out was this catalogue of really brutal, sadistic punishment. But of course, that individual just thought that was normal, that's how you discipline your child. So I think until we start asking questions in a way that individuals can respond to, that perhaps are less allow for more of an objective truth to come out rather than something that represents the biases and distortions of the individual. And I think also, people need to feel safe enough to tell their to tell their story, and it's very unlikely that she's in a position of feeling that safe at the moment, because of obviously she's faced these horrific charges.
Yeah. And would that then go back to what you were saying about the cards and the looking up the parents? She would bathe the children. She took handprints and footprints of the children. She would take locks of their hair. Do you think that she was doing that to go above and beyond to kind of make it seem like she hadn't done anything wrong? Or do you think there was something a bit more sadistic in that behaviour?
I have to say, it sends chills down my spine hearing about that now. But all of those sound like behaviours that a very caring nurse would do to make families feel as though their child was getting really good care in a service. And if somebody who genuinely cared about the babies as patients might do all of those things, but there's something really chilling about knowing that those actions were taken when these murders were planned and enacted. I think that's one of the things that really feels quite revolting about the whole set of circumstances.
Yeah. And as well, she took a photo of a baby. So she'd killed the twin, and she took a photo of the baby lying on its side, cuddling into the teddy bear of the dead twin. And the parents at the time thought that was a nice thing, but later realised that newborn babies can't roll over. And Lucy would have known that. So this is basic level criminal profiling, but my partner was a police officer and he did a diploma in criminal profiling. And some of the people that he looked at, they would almost teeter on the edge of how far they could go before they got caught. They got a thrill out of that. With Lucy, do you think that act was in order to teeter and see if she could get caught, or what's your thoughts on that?
I think your partner's observations may well be right. I think it's hard not to think there's a degree of excitement around killing, because if you really wanted to be apprehended and really wanted to be stopped, then why not resign your job and not put yourself in this position of being vulnerable to carrying on offending in this way? The reality is she didn't. She persisted. And so it's hard not to see there's a sense of excitement. I also think, the fact that there was such detailed diaries kept, kind of like a log of stuff. She was found with medical records at home that she shouldn't, they're things that you would be disciplined for as a staff member anyway. So there is a sense of kind of playing with fire a little bit. Now, it's also possible that part of her wanted to be caught subconsciously, so was perhaps leaving clues so that someone could, she might have felt little ability to control herself or inhibit herself, and so might have been struggling with the compulsion to kill, and might have at some level been relieved and wanted to be stopped. But I think both of those are possibilities.
And do you think the sending text to the colleague was for the same reason? Because after every incident, she was texting her colleagues about it. Do you think that fed into the same reasons as all the other acts she's done, or for something different?
Possibly. I mean, there was this notion of the flirtatiousness with the married doctor, wasn't there? And so, in hospitals, whenever there's kind of like serious violence or death, any kind of like tragedy, that often does pull staff together as it's that thing of like bonding through adversity. So actually those are real opportunities where people genuinely might bond. But I think there's a kind of like shallowness of those messages. It was commented that she was fine and okay to go into work when other members of the team were really distraught. And again, I'd say something there about she has not developed the ability to experience her emotions and tolerate them and deal with them in the way that a healthy person would be able to do.
Okay. And you'd said earlier about the healthcare setting. It's a power thing where you're looking after more vulnerable people, and I know that you've commented that about the police social work. And one of Lucy's friends said that Lucy had wanted to be a nurse for as long as she could remember. Do you think, is there anything she intended to be a nurse with the intent to power over her victims effectively, or do you think that it wasn't as long calculated as that, and that it maybe just happened when she got into the job and had the option?
I think there's a possibility it wasn't consciously thought about for that amount of time, but, I think, my experience is there are some people who know at some point in their life they're going to kill. And I think people do gravitate towards positions of power. That's why the Catholic Church is full of paedophilic priests. Elite boarding schools have had such a problem. People who have the desire to offend against other vulnerable people will seek out those opportunities. So I don't know, but I would suggest that may well have been an incentive to train as a nurse. And it's interesting that she specialised in neonatal care rather than specialising in some other form of elderly nursing, for instance, where presumably she wouldn't have been putting people at risk. And the reality is she could have changed specialism again if she wanted to be a nurse and didn't want to carry out acts of murder. But she's chosen that area. She's spoken about enjoying the excitement of neonatal care, and actually I found that quite an interesting use of word as well, because I think most of us associate, when we think about children, we think about kind of like the wish to care for and nurture. There's something really beautiful about the innocence of babies, and I think when people are, in terms of forensic is a classic area where people might be drawn to that for the kind of like the excitement to some degree. A&E, people kind of enjoy the excitement of not knowing how a day is going to go. But I think to choose neonatal care for the excitement, I think is quite striking, really.
Yeah, I thought that too, that when I think of neonatal, all I can think about is negative emotions, because no baby should be born fighting for their life. So I thought that as well. And obviously Lucy hasn't yet been sentenced, so at time of recording she's going to be sentenced tomorrow. And from your experience of working in prisons, what will prison be like for somebody like Lucy who has been convicted of murder and attempted murder but denies the behaviour?
Well, I don't think she'll have an easy time of it. I think there is a real hierarchy in prisons, and people always want somebody else to look down on and despise. And actually, there isn't anything worse than killing a child in terms of that hierarchy. So she will find herself vilified amongst the population. And I think, also in prisons, you have lots of other people who don't have an easy time in terms of managing their emotions, that are quite quickly enraged, and she I think she'll attract a lot of hostility and possibly violence in there. It's fairly typical for people to pose a risk to themselves when they're first convicted, and so there is usually a vigilance to whether somebody's a suicide risk at that point in time. And I don't know whether she has any history of trying to kill herself, but I would say prison is going to be a very, very difficult place for her to be.
And with you saying that they are at risk of harming themselves to begin with, I know that it was noted that Lucy was actually crying in court at times. Why would that be from your experience? Because as somebody who has no experience of working with people like this, I think you surely know the consequences of your actions. You surely knew that this was going to happen. But from your experience, does somebody like Lucy genuinely think that they're not going to get caught, or genuinely thinks that they've done nothing wrong?
I don't think it's not a cognitive problem. I've assessed loads of people in child and family proceedings where I've been asked to assess their intellectual functioning, because the social workers, the courts hasn't been able to understand how could this person keep shacking up with Schedule 1 offenders. They must have an intellectual problem, and very, very rarely is that being the case. And I think when people commit acts, everybody knows that murder is wrong, and if you get caught, you're going to prison. But we're talking about real disturbance in the emotional self, and this is a person who doesn't have an adequate grasp of her emotional self, isn't able to probably isn't able to identify what she's feeling a lot of the time, can't cope with it. And I said most people who commit acts of serious violence, they find it very difficult to tolerate feelings that make them feel vulnerable. So they find it very difficult to tolerate sadness, shame, fear. Instead, the only emotion they tend to really be able to manage is anger. And anger, of course, makes us feel powerful. So, and to some degree, we all do that. You know, if somebody hurts our feelings, we might get a bit annoyed with them and get into an argument, for example. Whereas this is kind of like an extreme form of using anger and aggression as a way of coping, and we see that much more often in men. So I think that's why the prison system is full of angry men, is because they're people who haven't been enabled to feel sad and cope with feelings of vulnerability. So they use anger as a way of defending themselves and protecting themselves. And in psychiatric hospitals, typically what you have is women who actually feel quite angry and not able to be angry because society, there's more of a taboo around women's anger. They need to be angry, but instead they're presenting as depressed because it's kind of emotions that get stuck because they're not true emotion, and the person doesn't all of our emotions have got an evolutionary purpose to them, and the whole point to sadness is to elicit comfort. And of course, if you're not able to be sad, then you're not getting comfort, so you end up kind of thwarted with your emotion. So I'm sorry if I've lost track of your question now.
No, that is so necessary to hear that. No, it was just, why was she crying? You know, if she knew she was going to prison.
Yeah, I mean, there has been the observation that her tears weren't around hearing the horror of what she'd done, but they were more about the loss of this, loss of esteem of this colleague who she was sexually, romantically interested in. Ultimately, I suppose her tears will be about herself rather than the consequences of her actions. But people do know intellectually what the consequences will be, but they can't cope with the emotion. And there's something in this person, because of the fact she's killed so many times in such a short period of time, there's a degree of compulsion that she feels that she has to act on something that she feels inside that probably she has very little grasp over.
Okay. And that leads perfectly into what I want to talk about next, is in prison, will she work with a psychologist? Because if you're saying that she can't handle the emotions and it's this compulsion, will she work with somebody in prison to try and change that in her?
Well, it's interesting because obviously in terms of when people first get convicted, they're not necessarily psychologically capable of doing the work that they need to do. She might still be, say, insisting that she's innocent, for instance, which makes it much harder to work with somebody. There are treatment programs available in prison, and actually the women's estate there tends to be more recognition of the fact that women who go to prison have got a history of trauma. My experience of working with both men and women is men have exactly the same histories, but men find it far harder to talk about it. So it's actually harder for men to access the treatment that they need in prison. But also, if she receives a whole life sentence, she will be quite low in terms of priority for treatment, because in prison, because it's a scarce resource, the priority tends to be for people who've got the most chance of getting out, or who, if people are serving a life sentence but they've gone over their tariff, they would be seen as a priority for accessing treatment. So somebody who gets a whole life sentence, like Lucy, if that's what she gets, I'm assuming that's what she'll get. She'll be very low down the priority list. There's a possibility that she would be considered to be clinically a psychopath, and there is a special service for women who have psychopathy. But I've no idea how oversubscribed that may be.
Tell us, is a whole life prison sentence, is that she will be in prison for the rest of her life unless she can prove that she is fit to be released?
A whole life sentence is set as a nominal period of 50 years. So that means that she would not be considered for, she'd be expected to die in prison. Now, she may appeal and that may be reduced, but I think that's unlikely. And I certainly wouldn't see that happening for a long time, because I think there would not be a climate that would make any judge want to make that kind of decision. I mean, of course, she's not been sentenced yet, so she may not get that. But if setting aside Lucy Letby, if somebody gets a life sentence, that what they in the UK, what they also get is a tariff, which is the minimum amount of time that must be served before somebody could be considered for release. And at that point, they have to prove that they've reduced their risk. And over time, the tariff that has been set, the minimum amount of time that someone must serve for an act of murder, has increased. And so I'd say a more commonplace murder might be the act of killing your partner, and in the case of domestic violence. And there was a point where if you'd killed your partner, your tariff might have been around, say, 12 years, but you might get as much as a 20-year tariff now. So there's a trend towards longer detention rather than shorter detention.
Yeah. And I suppose a big question then is, can somebody like Lucy be rehabilitated?
Well, my job for 17 years was to develop a treatment program for men who'd been considered to be untreatable psychopaths. And they'd either completed psychological treatment in prison and been considered to be just as risky at the end as they were at the start, or they'd started treatment and they'd been ejected for being disruptive during it, or they were considered just not suitable to do it in the first place. And when I first went to work, that was at Whitemore Prison, the Fens unit at Whitemore Prison. When I first went there, I met a lot of, because the unit had not been open that long. It'd been open for 3 years, but without any treatment. And many of the men had been in prison for well over their tariff. So a lot of them were men who were in their late 40s, 50s, even 60s, and they'd spent, 20 or 30 years in prison. And I did feel a little bit like, oh my God, are these men going to be hopeless cases? And actually I saw people make amazing progress. So I think in prison you meet people who will just go through the motions because they want to convince a parole board that they're safe to be released, and their main motivation is to get out of jail. But you also meet people who actually, they're not really even thinking about getting out of prison again. They want to feel at peace with themselves, and they want the reassurance that they're not going to kill again. So I've no idea where Lucy Letby would fall on that spectrum of behaviours. At this point in time, I think that would be hard to tell anyway, because it's quite often people need the enormity of what they've done to sink in before they're able to get some kind of wake-up call and think about treatment. So I personally am an optimistic kind of person, and I would hate to write anybody off, and I think people should be given the chance to change. And actually, if we're not giving people those opportunities, then actually the prison becomes very difficult for officers to manage, because what incentive is there for people to behave themselves if they've got no opportunities for getting out?
Yeah, and that is absolutely right. I've spoken with some officers who have been in the service so long that they have admitted that they've started to lose hope, and it is a very dangerous place to be, because one of your main jobs, as a residential officer, for example, in Scotland, your main job is to help rehabilitate people and turn their lives around. So, yep, you're absolutely right. They need to maintain that hope. And my final question for you is, for prison staff, prison officers, psychologists like yourself, working with very violent people, how do you manage to separate your potential personal feelings for what that person's done with your professional duty to help them, care for them, and help them change who they are?
Well, that's a really good question. I think people vary enormously in their ability to manage that. So I was thinking earlier about, when you'd asked me about what will it be like for her when she goes to prison. Well, she will also get a lot of hostility from staff, probably. So the vast majority of staff will behave in a very professional way, but she will be able to detect an animosity towards her, no doubt. And I've heard officers make, I've worked with lots of really fantastic, amazing officers who have been enormously compassionate, but I have also worked with and heard, quite hateful comments. And it comes from a place of fear and disgust. But because people don't talk about those kind of emotions in the prison system, it's not just the prisoners that don't talk about their emotions, staff don't too. But actually, as a psychologist, I personally think you have to be able to find something, you have to be working towards finding something to like and care for in the person. So, of course, if your response to somebody is to feel quite disgusted by what they've done, then I personally would be having conversations about that, but not from a place of you are disgusting, but from a place of, I'm really disgusted by what's happened, but I want to find a way to work with you. And she's probably disgusted by herself at some level. And so I'd be having quite frank conversations about those sorts of things. But I would also say that's quite unusual. So in the prison system, so in the unit that I worked in, we did expect people to work towards liking and caring for the prisoners that they worked with. And in fact, the men in the service, it was a 5-year treatment programme. And at year 3, typically, the men would, at the start of treatment, people were always saying, oh, I'm alone, or I don't want anything to do with anyone here. But by year 3, they were saying, this is the first time in my life I've ever felt loved and cared for. So we were successful at creating that. But staff have clinical supervision. And I think it's really important that supervision is focused on the emotional response to the people that you're working with. And I think too often psychologists engage in supervision at an intellectual level. And I've heard lots of psychologists say, well, I'm professional, I don't have to like somebody to offer them therapy. Actually, I don't see how you can be an effective therapist if you cannot find something to like about the person. And whoever's going to be working with Lucy Letby needs to be capable of seeing the monstrous acts that she's committed, but they also need to be able to see the part of her that's very hurt and damaged. And, I'm confident that there is that part to her, because I have never met anybody who's committed an act of murder where they haven't had that part present.
And I suppose that's why you just said that there will be a level of her that's disgusted with herself.
Yeah. It might be very fleeting and she might not be able to hold on to that for very long, but that's therapy might involve, would probably involve having to work with that part and help her develop the capacity. But that would be, in my mind, that's work for further down the line, because actually if you can't have empathy and compassion for yourself in terms of her childhood experiences, how on earth can you have compassion for your victims?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for this. You have taught me so much. I have no doubt that you will have taught my listeners so much. It's been such an invaluable conversation. So thank you so much for your time.
Oh, thank you. Thank you very much for inviting me on. And great questions as well. So it's nice to have thoughtful questions and not have to feel like you have to defend a position where there might be a little bit more compassion for somebody who's done something awful.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. That means a lot.